All right, this is our podcast about books. I'm Jeff, and I'm here with Tom, and
Hello.
our special guest today is Christine Daigle.
Hi.
Christine is a you have written a ton of sci-fi under the name LP Styles,
Yep.
and also have some standalone novels. After this is published, so the you'll have before this is published, you'll have one coming out called Heavy Are the Stones that you're co-writing with JD Barker.
Yep.
And is it a thriller? It's a
Yeah,
thriller.
it's a serial killer thriller, just straight up. If
Nice.
you like, Silence of the Lambs 7, you will like this book. If you don't, you will not like this book.
Awesome. Yeah, but you should go get it and rate it 5 stars anyway. And then you are also a neuropsychologist, which I
Yes.
think is awesome and perfect for the book we're talking about, The Andromeda Strain, today.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's just get into the book. Written in 1969, by Michael Crichton, who I am super excited to talk about. Yeah, it's his first novel under his name. I'm trying to think what else I learned in the research that was interesting. It's his sixth novel total.
Okay.
Fun fact, he wrote six crime thrillers under the name John Lang.
Yes, Hard
Uh,
Case Crime republished them all not too long ago.
did
Oh,
you really?
fun.
That's
Yeah, I
fascinating.
haven't read any of them, but
Um,
No.
yeah, I don't, the covers, the old covers are interesting. They're like a man holding a gun, dipping a woman in a passionate kiss. It like true
Yeah. Well,
like
that's a hard case's MO, right? Those
yeah,
trophy
they've done
covers.
that with
Yeah.
a lot of them. They're great.
but yeah, so all right, what did we Christine, we don't care about spoilers, so
Okay.
feel free
I'll
to
spoil
spoil it.
it
We're gonna
then.
warn people what we're talking about before they get the podcast episode. So if they haven't read it, that's on them. Um, what did we think of the book? What do we think of Andromeda Strain?
Oh, we're just gonna go right there, huh?
Let's just go right to
Yeah.
it. Let's just get to it.
Um,
Were we pro Andromeda Strain? Post Andromeda? What one
you
out
know,
of
I was
five? How
just
do we
so
feel?
surprised how hard sci-fi and technical it was. Um, yeah, because I had read Jurassic Park, right? That's the only other Michael Crichton book that I have read, which doesn't mean anything because I will chronically only read one book by an author because I like to read lots of authors,
Yeah,
which I
I think a lot
probably
of people are that way.
Yeah.
shouldn't admit being an
Mhm.
author. Please read all my books. But yeah, it was a bit of a struggle for me because it was just so technical. I kind of felt like I was reading my old college biology and chemistry textbooks a
That's
lot of
hysterical.
the
Yeah.
he was, did you know that enzymes are the catalyst for life? I was like, yes, I was a biochem major in undergrad. I did know that.
It's an organism with no carbon. Yeah, it was yeah. Tom, what were your thoughts?
Oh my gosh. This I have so much to say about this book because it broke me in many different
Was
ways.
this also your first kind of venture
First
into
Crichton.
Michael
Yeah,
Crichton?
so if this is the first time that you're listening to our podcast this season, we are doing classics of the genre, meaning
Sorry, I always forget to say that.
we
I'm the
have no
worst.
idea what order we are putting these up in or what order people will listen to them in. So, and try not to be repetitive, but it's important because one, people are like, why did you pick this book? And two, we will not be doing this next season. So stick with us for maybe more books that we like.
That's so
But
bad. Oh man.
it's,
But wait,
but
he
even if
does
we
get
don't,
better.
even
He
if we
does.
don't
Michael
like a
Crichton gets better.
even if we don't like a book, I find these conversations fascinating. And here's what I found fascinating about this was I liked this book, even though I hated everything about how it was built and told. And yet I was fascinated. I know I could talk about this all
It's
day.
really funny.
There's no character development. The plot structure is all wrong. It's everything about this is wrong, except that. And I was listening on audio, and David Morse was the narrator. He did a fabulous job. The three different scientists are super distinct, and the voices are great. Probably more than they deserve from what was on the page.
Yeah,
Um, I don't know. Did you listen to it, Jeff, or did you read it?
I read it.
Uh, on and off of both.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I especially liked his Burton was fabulous, but all of his characters, all of the readings was great. Um, yeah, it follows none of the conventions you're supposed to. It's drove me crazy the foreshadowing. Like if you can't create suspense through character interaction, you don't get to say, but he would be wrong about that.
Oh,
Over and over and over again.
He does
yeah,
it all
the
the time.
omniscient
Constantly. And
viewpoint.
what he's saying is something good is coming, but I haven't figured out how to keep you interested. So I'm going to tell you, hey, something good is coming.
Yeah.
And yet, as a classic of the genre, I can see in people like Dan Brown and people like Lee Child this sort of love of the deep, deep detail info dump, which in in a Reacher novel, he will tell you everything there is to know about a certain kind of safe, but then he tells you that because he's going to tell you how Reacher uses that knowledge to open the safe. That doesn't happen in this book.
Yeah,
It's
that's
like,
not how Crichton
here's
rolls.
here's
No.
10 pages on enzymes that aren't actually going to matter to the rest of the book.
Yes.
And yet I kept listening because I was like, I'm really interested by some of these concepts.
Yes.
And I imagine in 1969, all the gadgetry was super interesting, right? It's like watching a James Bond movie when you're like, it's 40 years old and you're like, yeah, gee whiz, Q, that's great. Um, so yeah, but I should have hated this book. And yet there were times when I was listening avidly and sort of like couldn't wait to get back to it. So
Yeah.
but everything that I love and teach about storytelling was absent from this book.
No, I felt the same way, Tom, now that you say that. And I was thinking about it because, yeah, there's zero character development. He commits a cardinal sin. Here are these five guys and info dumps their backstory,
Oh,
page after
paragraphs
page,
and paragraphs and
with their
paragraphs.
research studies. I'm like, oh my gosh, please
Yep.
stop.
Just
And
tells you their personalities. He's a
there's
generally unhappy man.
yeah, there's not much of a story. There's a plot, but it's not organized in a way that kind of makes an interesting story. But it does what sci-fi does best, and that is it poses those big ideas, those what ifs. And that's what sci-fi is kind of all about. Like sci-fi can be any genre. You can have romance or western, but I think for it to predominantly be sci-fi, you have to pose a big idea. And he does it again and again and again. It's like, oh, what if our first interaction with extraterrestrial life is with a virus or a bacteria? And I mean, that's still possible. That's still terrifying. So that is interesting. And then what if we bring back a plague from the moon? It's 1969,
Yeah.
Mhm.
right? That's moon landing time. Of course, people are interested in that. And
Terrified of
then,
it. Yeah.
I
But
mean, a
those are
lot of
thought
it still
experiments.
holds. Yeah, like
Those are
what if we use these space germs for warfare? Of
yeah,
course we would. Of
of
course.
course we will.
Yeah.
But those are thought experiments, whereas real sci-fi is how do humans react and change, and how are our morals affected and our
Yeah.
preconceptions affected by these things. And you get
Yeah.
none of that.
No, it was more like cosmic horror. Spoiler,
Yeah.
spoiler. They do all these things to save the world and they have no control over
Yeah.
it.
And they
So,
almost make it worse.
and they almost make it worse. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very cosmic horror.
Um, I
The
I
Go
think
ahead.
I'll reveal at this point. I have read every Michael Crichton novel written
Oh, wow.
under his own
Really?
name.
So I had read none, which is why
This
Crichton
is
was on the list.
this is the only one I hadn't read.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll just drop that.
And
He
how
does
do
get
they
better though,
compare?
right, Jeff? He gets better.
He does.
Long
I mean,
pause.
in high school, I was obsessed. I was literally obsessed. I read everything he wrote. But except I just couldn't. I don't think I ever got my hands on this one. I think that's the only
Mhm.
reason I didn't read it. Something he does. So how does they compare? He does this thing that we're kind of talking about that I find really interesting in that there are no main characters until chapter 5. And that's like a Michael Crichton thing. Like every book, he starts with this, like you're talking about, Christine, he starts with this giant thought experiment problem. Like, what if dinosaurs were cloned on an island? So like Jurassic Park starts with dinosaurs have already escaped from the island in the first chapter, and there's like little bitty dinosaurs eating babies in cribs. Like that's how it starts. And like you're like, what is happening? And we don't get to like, but like this one, you don't meet the what's his name, Jeremy Stone.
Yeah.
You don't meet him until chapter 5. He's like at a dinner party.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you go into like the 10 pages of just like backstory drop that you were describing.
Mhm.
But yeah, it felt, I don't know that I'd say Michael Crichton gets better. This felt like a standard Michael Crichton novel to me. I was like, this is how they roll.
You
So
know, it was interesting because I was thinking about Andy Weir a lot while I was reading this because he's also a science thriller writer,
Hmm.
very, very technical writer, but has a lot more character. Like
Yeah.
Mark Watney is so fun. And I'm like, we just had none of that in this book at all. There's no fun characters, like no character depth.
He tells you
Um,
when he's introducing them, all of these guys are jerks.
yeah,
He's
they're
got
all
four
jerks.
doctors and they're all jerks. He's like, none of them like people. They're all terrible. Yeah.
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
think of that compared to The Big Short, where he's introducing terrible people who are actually real people, but he's giving them like inner lives. And like he manages to really, in a nonfiction book, Michael
Yeah.
Lewis manages to really dig into these characters and make them fascinating. And this does not happen here. And I think perhaps my expectation was thrown off from Jurassic Park because of course it was Spielberg who
Yeah.
is all character development.
Hmm.
Like, sure, everybody loves how many spectacular visuals there are in Spielberg, but it's all character development.
Mhm.
And he brought that to Jurassic Park uh, deeply. And I haven't read the book, so it sounds like perhaps it's not quite there in the book.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think it's one of those instances where I did read the book. I was a
yeah.
young adult, so I don't have a strong recollection of it. I remember liking it okay. So I think it's
Hmm.
one of those instances where I like the movie better than the
Yeah.
book. Yeah.
Yeah. There's other things Crichton does that I think are fascinating. He does it in Andromeda Strain too. So I've actually never, I read this about him. I've never heard him like say this, but a lot of times he'll have theories in his book that he's making fun of, but he doesn't openly make fun of them. So like Jurassic Park, he thought chaos theory was really funny. So he was like quasi mocking chaos theory with that book. But in this one, I have a suspicion he thinks the whole like government government bureaucracy of like let's create safe, clean environments out in the middle of New Mexico. I think Crichton probably found that really funny. I don't think he actually thinks
He doesn't believe it.
he doesn't
Well, it's
believe it.
short-sighted, right? Like
Yeah.
he's like to try to, which is kind of how I feel about like nuclear waste sequestration. Like we're going to leave messages for people 100,000 years from now saying, "Hey, don't open this." Like the idea that that's going to work is
They're
kind of
gonna open
crazy.
it.
And in this one, it's like you're going to build this entire thing with 5 painstakingly described levels of 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 cleansing, and then like, oh yeah, but what happens if all the plastic dissolves, right?
Yeah.
All those seals are going to break. You
All
don't
this is
know.
right.
You don't know
Yeah.
what's going to happen. So yeah, I understand his point,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah.
Were there any scenes we liked, any strengths of the book? Like what did we find good about the book?
Oh yeah. No, I do think other than the big idea, I mean the prose, of course, is very commercial in a lot of spots, which is harder to do than it looks
Mhm.
to make your prose kind of disappear. Um, So especially at the beginning, he did that. I mean, it got kind of technical later on, but the beginning he did a good job, and he gave puzzles to solve, right?
Yeah.
Readers love puzzles. You know, what's the same about a baby and an old man? Why are they the only
Hmm.
two survivors? So I thought he did a good job with that.
Then you throw a cop in there. It's like,
Yeah,
oh, but it's a cop with diabetes. So how does
yes,
that work? Yeah.
yeah.
Right.
I mean, he did throw in some puzzles he didn't solve, or thought experiments he didn't solve. I don't know if you noticed this, but he's like, oh, if aliens communicated with us, they wouldn't use physics because it's going to be expensive or light takes billions of years. So they'd use these cheap replicating organisms to communicate with us. And I'm like, yes.
Yes, we're
And
gonna
then
get aliens talking. Yeah.
he never fires Chekhov's gun. I'm like,
Oh,
No.
he
aliens would
does.
never.
He does. Oh, look, can we
Where?
talk about the end?
Where? Yes, please
I
tell
thought
me
they
at the
just go
end.
back to space.
My
They just
yes,
become like dormant or
they go
something.
back to no, they go back to space where they dissolve all plastic and organic matter. I took it. This is just I took it that this thing was sent to envelop the Earth and keep us from leaving. They've canceled space flight until they
Fascinating.
figured out, because, despite atoms thinking we're mostly harmless, another space space intelligence might look at it and be like, oh, those guys are trouble, let's keep them right there.
Interesting.
And it's
I missed
it's
that.
buried at the end, which made me think of Tuck Everlasting, which was another book that we read this series, where you have to read the epilogue to realize that like something happened, which is a horrible way to write a book.
Yeah, that this is
um
actually a novel about how much we hate progress.
I felt like the end of this book of Andromeda Strain was saying, the aliens saying, you're not ready,
Interesting.
and we're not letting you off the planet, because like the whole purpose of the virus is that it rises up above the atmosphere and encircles the Earth, and it's going to keep any spaceship from leaving until they figure it out.
Fascinating. I didn't catch that at the end at
I didn't
all.
catch that either. Tom is
Yeah.
smarter than both of us.
But do you
Yeah.
remember that? Do you remember that the epilogue is like the guy from NASA doing a press conference, like,
Yeah.
oh, the Russians
It's
have
and he
also.
said it's out of our hands is like
Right.
the last line or
I
something.
was
Yeah.
I was a little
Whose hands is it in?
bleary-eyed
If it's
at the
out
end
of
of
their
that.
hands, whose hands is it? Whose hands is it in?
It's so funny.
It's and he also references that the Russians are having the same problem,
Mhm.
right? So
Fascinating.
this is not like the space shuttle where they have to figure out why the space shuttle went wrong. This is like globally, spaceships are not being allowed to leave the
Interesting.
Earth, which
I
was
totally missed that
fascinating.
conclusion.
So did I.
So I like that. Again, there's parts of the storytelling that I can see as seeds for the way that people like Dan Brown write. And a lot of people, don't like Dan Brown. I happen to think his books are fun, but it's because he's tying all those puzzles together in a way that keeps me going. So I love the puzzle stuff. And I just inexplicably enjoyed listening to this book, even though there's so much about it that I really didn't like. So
And
I make of that what you want.
yeah.
I would teach this book as a book of like how to fail on so many levels, and yet, right?
Yeah. I think
So.
it's easy to say, this book is terrible, but it sold well. So I think
Oh,
you
it's
have to look
really
at
well.
it
Launched
and
his
say,
career.
why did this book sell well? And I think, you really do have to look at it. One other thing I've noticed is because I read, a lot of genres, and I started like an epic fantasy, standard fantasy, maybe like leaning with some romantic or cozy. I like all the fantasy. And it's really interesting to look at the Kindle highlights if you read electronically, what people highlight. And those type of readers highlight things that are like pretty or heartfelt or like something
Mhm.
that just makes you go, "Ah." And in the thrillers and the sci-fi, it's the facts.
Yeah.
Like people will highlight what makes the composition of the atmosphere.
Yep.
And I just find as a writer that that's like fascinating to see the two different audiences and what they gravitate towards as being important. And they like the facts, they like the knowledge.
I
Yeah.
always thought of Crichton more as a mystery writer than as a sci-fi writer. I
Mm.
don't think he's a thriller mystery. Like, and I can remember I used to read his books with a piece of paper, like a notepad next to me, looking for the clues. I'm like, what's the next clue? What's the next thing? Like, as I totally understand highlighting like the composition of the atmosphere, because you're like, what, maybe that's going to have something to do with how we solve this problem. I will say one of the things I like that he does really well, I think in this book, Christine, you already mentioned it a little bit, is he talks to the reader like they're smart, which I think why I was such a huge fan of his as a teenager is I liked reading books that made me feel like I was really smart. Because I wouldn't understand half of what he was talking about a lot of times, but
Mm.
you kind of don't need to. You kind of just need the vibe of it. Like you can kind of like skim over all the technical stuff and be like, yeah, I just read all that technical stuff. I'm really smart, even though I didn't get it at the time at all. So there's something about the way he does this like science detail that's clear enough that it makes it feel real, and then also like clean, I guess, or relatable enough that it makes you feel like you're actually part of what's happening, which I think is a trick that he plays really well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, although it gets to the point where he introduces a new term and you're like, and you just brace yourself, right? Because you know there's going to be 4 pages of explanation. He's not going to introduce a term and then keep going
Yeah, well,
or
and this was
footnote
before
it.
Google. Like you couldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
it was before you could go Google things. So like
right.
he'd introduce a term and I'd be like, "Ooh, I'm learning something right now about this
But
thing."
it's the
Yeah.
same sort of thing that if you saw in a fantasy writer, which you do see in a fantasy writer, you'd be like, no, 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 that's telling, not showing.
Yeah, I don't
Stop.
need you to do
Right?
that.
Like,
Yeah.
don't tell me the entire history of the Elven kingdom if I don't need it for this story. You know what just dawned on me also that I completely forgotten? ER.
Oh yeah.
ER was based on Michael Crichton stuff, which, we used to jokingly be like, I need a cross table C spine gastric lavage chem 7 stat
Mhm.
because they used medical detail to make you feel like the show was real. But that show was, again, all about character growth, which means somebody else was driving the train on
Yeah.
that, I
Yeah.
think. But there is this undeniable love of that sort of detail, whether it's scientific, medical, whatever, that's something that we respond to. I clearly responded to it, even though I didn't want to.
Yeah. The one
What
character I thought he did a good job with was Peter Jackson. That guy was hilarious. The grumpy old man.
yeah, the
Yeah.
grumpy old man's the best. He's got the best
Who
voice.
they
He's
left in
amazing.
level 5,
Yeah.
by the way.
They totally just leave him and the baby to die. Yeah. What did y'all think of the absolute lack of compassion for the baby?
Oh, that poor baby.
They they literally
They're like,
find
it's
it in
crying
town and
Do
they're
you want to
again.
like,
get really dark?
yeah.
Yeah.
What did the baby go insane?
Wait, what did you say?
Did
When
the
did the
baby
baby
go insane?
Oh, I think
Because
yeah.
people who are only halfway, there's Jackson had this sort of full acidosis, but what if the baby was only a little alkaline? I
Yeah.
mean, did the baby go insane, and what would that be like for a baby strapped to a gurney? This is a
Yeah.
dark thought.
Yeah, he literally has a baby strapped to a gurney for the entire book, and no one seems to be there. They have an intravenous like food going to it, but no one seems to be nurturing this baby
Yeah.
or caring for this
No.
baby.
Well, and I mean, I know it's 1969, but you get to the part about like the cages and cages of Reese's monkeys, and you're like, ugh.
Yeah, or they find the
Yeah.
baby and they're like there's something crying. There's two, I think it's Stone and maybe Levitt. I can't remember which one it is. Leave it
Yeah.
walking around the town and they find the baby and they're just neither of them pick it up. Nobody cares.
Right.
They just leave it screaming in its crib as they sit there and talk about like, boy, this is weird that a baby survived this thing. Like,
It's Stone and Burton does eventually pick it up because
yeah, but not for a while.
Burton is the most, I thought, sympathetic of all the
Yeah,
characters. Um,
yeah, so
yeah,
funny.
But yeah,
but
in his omniscient voice, what did he call it? A chronicle of stupid and deadly blunders.
yes,
But also heroism and intelligence. And like, thank you for describing your own writing for
Yeah,
us.
it's really funny.
I did. So let's talk about that narrator voice for a minute, because at one point it sort of felt like a medical journal report, like this was like a NASA report. At other times it felt more like Michael Lewis, which is like, I am going to tell you what these people did and how they failed or how they succeeded, um and I have the omniscience to tell you when they're on the wrong track, even though that like spoils all the actual suspense. But
Yeah, Christine, did you have any thoughts on it? I'll let you go.
Yeah, well, I mean, I kept thinking about that because I'm like, oh, omniscient perspective, because that's not in fashion really much anymore. Um,
Yeah, well, it's so separate from the characters. It like
yeah,
it's
there's
such
so
a
much
yeah.
distance between the characters and the narrator, and I really felt that distance. And some people still do it really well,
Hmm.
omniscient, but they manage to do omniscient without so much distance. But I felt that distance, and I was like, I could use a little first person or close
Yeah,
third.
I could pull in here a little
Yeah,
bit.
and then just like some of the complications, the way that he would explain them, and there's this mechanical failure that cannot be detected by man or machine, and I'm just like, and the substations were a month from being completed. It was just a lot of complications that seemed contrived or convenient. I
Yeah.
like at one point leave it like has a solution, but then has a seizure and forgets it. I'm like, okay. I mean,
That was my favorite part. He's like, "Oh my gosh, I have it," and now it's gone.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and now I had a
The,
seizure.
I lost 10 minutes, and I don't know what happened. Yeah, that
Yeah.
was great. Yeah, one of the things the narrator voice kept doing that drives me crazy in thrillers because it pulls the tension out is he kept telling us in 10 years when he wrote a paper on this,
right.
he would blah 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 blah. So like my like, mystery reader writer brain is like, well, this guy survives. Like it's
Right.
Survives,
like
yeah.
this
Yeah.
guy survives. I'm
Yeah.
like, so in the end, you've got like Hall like crawling through this weird pipeline to get to the key, which I want to talk about in a second, so that he can stop the self-destruct. And I'm like, I know he doesn't die because you already told me that in 10 years he's going to write a paper about this. So I don't like, I don't know, it just pulls all
Yeah.
rips the tension out of there. But
Yeah. What do you make of a story that's been largely a puzzle solving story ending with an action sequence and none of the scientists actually solving the problem? The strain
Yeah.
solves its own problem. It mutates without them, with or without them.
yeah, they're
Like
they're
nothing,
literally irrelevant to everything that's happening.
they're irrelevant, and the climax is that they avoid blowing themselves up. But they don't do it with brains, they do it with a
Action
physical
sequence.
action sequence, which seems to undercut almost everything that the book is about, unless the book is about like we're dumb and we should wait till the aliens come and tell us we're ready.
Maybe that's what I was saying earlier. I was like, it was more like cosmic horror. I'm like, because you don't matter at all.
Yeah.
This strain is
Yeah.
gonna do what it's, and that felt out of place in the book. It was probably the part that's most familiar to me as being like a modern action thriller sequence. I'm like, yeah, they've got all the things. They've got
Hmm.
the obstacles. He's being drugged, getting shot with the darts. It's getting harder. They have the
Mhm.
ticking clock. Those are all the things you're like, yes, you want those in your thriller, but it was just so out of place with the rest of the book. It was odd. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a weird and I'm thinking through the Crichton novels in my head right now, and I think they all kind of have that kind of ending. The scientists
Yeah,
almost
with a,
never save the day. Like in Jurassic Park, for example, it's like, let's get off of this island. I'm
yeah.
trying to remember the ending of Sphere. I think that one they actually do solve it. The scientists actually solve the problem. But then like State of Fear and the one at Next and the one about about nanotechnology, by the end, they're all just action thrillers. You're just literally running away from the like science that is about to eat you. Yeah.
So do
Maybe
you think that's his
that's what I was gonna say.
overwhelming message, is that
Yeah.
scientists aren't gonna save us?
Yeah, one of his major themes that he has said is a major theme is the failure of man to actually comprehend technology and science. That's
Yeah.
like his like we create things, they become
Mhm.
monsters, they eat us, and
Yes.
we run away in panic. Yeah.
And that's like a major sci-fi theme, right? Like technology is going to save the world or destroy it. Science is going to save the world or destroy it. That's probably one of the most explored sci-fi
Yeah.
themes. And what does this mean for our humanity? Like usually
Yeah.
they tie it what does this mean about us being human? And that's pretty much sci-fi in a nutshell a lot of the time.
And so if you look at it that way, then
Yeah.
that ending, the epilogue ending, I think confirms that, because the end of the book itself is Stone saying, we have to understand, we have to, that's how we solved this. We've solved this by understanding. And the epilogue is being like, actually, you really don't know what's happening. Like you don't even realize if you take that as what happens, it's almost that like pull out at the end of zoom out that some movies have at the end, where you realize like, oh, they've been in a snow globe the whole time. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
somebody's been watching this and laughing. I hate manufactured suspense, and so every time he did those foreshadowings, it made me crazy. It made me think of I read a book by Ruth Ware, who's incredibly popular. And if Ruth Ware, if you're listening, come on the show. We'd love to have you. Um, but but the suspense was built by characters who know something that the reader doesn't. And
Yeah.
that's the only reason it's suspenseful, is because you find out that that's really her father or whatever. And it's like, but she knows it's her father. If she's finding out, great. Like, bring me along with that great reveal. But if the reveal is that the character you've been following already knows something and didn't tell you, that gets me really annoyed. And he sort of keeps doing that by saying like, they didn't know that X was going to go wrong. And
Yeah.
it's like, okay, now am I suspenseful of what's going to go wrong because now I know something's going to go wrong? I don't know. uh, Christine, you're the one here who has some professional skills. So,
Tom and I are
no
totally
offense,
worthless.
Jeff. No offense.
Unlike the book, in this
I personally am
situation,
totally
the
worthless.
woman is the one with all the scientific knowledge, not the
We
only.
didn't even get there, but man,
Oh, I do want to talk about the one man theory. Sorry, the odd man theory.
The
Sorry,
odd
what
man
were
out, yeah.
yeah, what were you to ask, Christine? I'm sorry.
I was going to ask Christine if she had any sort of neuropsychological insight on why this works for people. Like, is it just like we love hearing experts, or we want to be an expert, or like what is going
Oh,
on that I could read this book and be fascinated by it while hating it?
well, I think it is a combination of things. Yeah, there is I forget what it's called, but there is something like people believe experts. If you're a noted expert in the field, they believe you. So I do think that is something that is for sure. Like the dialogue was a lot of when the scientists were talking, I think like what experts should sound like
Mhm.
in your head. He's like, this is how they should talk if they're real scientists. I don't think any scientists talk like that. I think they mostly have bad mouths. But anyway, but yeah, it sounded expert. And I think it's like what you said, that it makes you feel smart. Like it makes you feel like you're solving it with them, you're with them or a step ahead. I think readers like that in a puzzle. I think those just big what if this happens and you're figuring it out. I think that's really why people find this fascinating. But I think you're right about the expert thing too. There's something in that. Yeah.
Yeah, I, thinking back to reading all of his books as a teenager, I agree. That's kind of what happened to me. It was, I was like, oh, I feel like I'm listening to experts and I'm keeping up
One
with
of them.
them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I'm one
even though
of
I
them,
wasn't.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, which made
And
me
he
feel very special. As a
and he
science geek as a kid, I was like, see, we are going to save the world.
right. And he throws you a few bones too, right? Like you can
Mhm.
clearly figure out that it has something to do with 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 breath coming in, where you have one person who's huffing sterno and the other is a baby that's screaming at the top of their lungs. Both of you're like, okay, so it's got something to do with breathing or the oxygen levels or something. So
Yeah.
he gives those so that you can figure something out.
Yeah.
I think, and that's very much on purpose.
Yeah, and you're with them. He does a nice twist on that with I forget who the seal breaks and they start giving him oxygen. Is it Burton?
It's Burton,
It's
yeah.
Burton, yeah.
Um and we've got it. We've got it. It's the oxygen. And then it's like, actually no, that's gonna kill you.
Yeah.
So, you're kind of with them and you're like, what is this? And then when they solve it, you're like, oh, again, it's surprising but inevitable. And like that makes sense. Because this whole time you're like, this baby is not acidic. Like, what is going on? And then when they explain like a very basic biological concept of
Mm.
pH levels where organisms can survive, you're like, yeah, of course. Sorry, that was a huge spoiler.
No, like I said, if you listen to this before
Yeah.
you read it, you're on your own. Yeah.
And you get it right at the same time they do. Like my aha was the same as their aha, so I felt like I was right with them. And I to me that makes, a compelling puzzle. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Seriously. Um, any other parts of the plot or the story y'all want to hit on?
Oh, I
Go
wanted
a
to
Well,
little
ask
bigger.
Tom because you were saying
yeah.
about the things that were set up and you're like, of course. So they set up that odd man out way early.
Where?
And then way early and then they paid it off.
Yeah.
I don't know. What
For
do you think
anybody
about that,
listening
Tom?
that doesn't
So
read it, the
so
odd man
here's
out
the
is the
thing.
theory that a
Yeah.
single man is the best to make critical decisions because he's the least encumbered emotionally. Sorry, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah. Uh, and it was sort of fascinating that they had done these studies to figure out that they didn't assume it would be the single man, that they actually did statistical studies and be like,
Mhm.
hey, it turns out it's the sequel the sequel man. And frankly, if anyone, in terms of spoilers, if anyone's listening to this who hasn't read the book, I can't imagine that they're going to run out and read the book. So uh we maybe they'd be like, oh, those doofuses hated it, I'll probably love
Uh,
it. So if I'm writing, yeah, it's a setup and a payoff, but it's obvious, just like the setup and payoff of the epilepsy. Um and it's obvious, like if I were advising someone on this, or I was doing it, it'd be like, okay, you know Hall is going to either fall in love down there, or he's going to have some sort of friendship bond that is just as strong, and he's going to fail, and somebody else is going to have to convince him to do it, overcome it, or something. Like, there's no, that would be a character driven plot that you would set up by messing with expectations that he's going to be the one that
and he hints
is
to
least
it as
likely.
like Crichton hints to it as well, because he's like, oh, this key, we think it'll only work for Hall, but it's actually kind of broken. There's been problems with it. So you're like, oh,
Right.
so somebody
Or
might pick up the key and make it work later.
yeah,
Yeah.
or pick him up, and
Yeah.
or convince him, right? But you could have had an amazing emotional climax where he has to make the decision, and it actually turns out to be super hard.
Yeah.
And but he's not making that decision. He's making the decision to try to save everybody, which everybody would make the same decision.
Mm-hmm.
So this, the whole point of the one man theory is that somebody might have to decide, yes, I'm going to kill us all to save the planet, which also would have been wonderfully ironic, since the strain was
Yeah.
doing its own thing anyway, and they were useless. It'd be great if they blew themselves up, uh, and be like, "We saved everyone, yay!" And everyone was like, "Nothing was wrong. Everything
Yeah.
was fine." So yeah, I think it's a basic failure of how you set up an emotional journey. And I mean, and it always comes back to, like, why did I keep listening? And it's not because of I mean, I would have, because of the podcast. I would have been like, well, I said I was going to read it, I'm going to read it. But even if I had not agreed to, I would probably have finished to find out what happens. Um and and so I am continually sort of mystified by this book, because something is working, despite all the things that make me say it's an utter failure. So
I'm just
I keep
curious.
coming
Have
back
either
to
of
it.
you read the new Crichton book that James Patterson finished, Eruption? No.
No.
I just wondered how that would be different than a Crichton book, if there would be.
I will say his books get more
Yeah.
movie-esque um,
Yeah.
as he goes. Like, so he never does what Michael Lewis does, like Tom was talking about with Moneyball. What Lewis does that makes unlikable characters likable is when he introduces them with the ways that they've been underdogs and ignored and flawed. He always does, like, yeah, this guy's a jerk and he doesn't listen to anybody and he doesn't talk to people well. He has zero people skills, but you got to understand he was bullied his whole life and he's had to like fight and climb all the way to the top, and that's what made him who he is. Or like, yeah, this guy is off on his own doing his own global trading thing and everybody hates him, but you need to understand that his brother completed suicide because of the impact of the and so he's kind of like on a cause-based war against this industry. So like you don't get that of any of Crichton's characters. I don't think
No,
ever. They're all like,
there is no wound explained for any flaws
yeah, they're all like
at all.
perfect specimens of science.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, I'm just gonna read you the Crichton run because this is his run of this book sets off a run of super hits. He does Terminal Man, which is made into a movie, The Great Train Robbery, which is then made into a movie, Eaters of the Dead, which later becomes The 13th Warriors, Congo, Sphere, Jurassic Park, Rising Sun, Disclosure, The Lost World. All of those become like major blockbuster films. Then he writes one called Airframe, which is a weird one, and another one called Timeline. Like he gets into like the modern last five don't really go anywhere. Their Airframe, Timeline, Prey is about nanotechnology. State of Fear is a fascinating climate denial book. Have y'all ever read? Y'all haven't seen State of Fear? It's his book where eco-terrorists are making up climate change, and
Right.
it's the only book he wrote that he actually footnotes. to my knowledge, where he has like scientific articles that are footnoted. But another weird thing about Crichton and Andromeda Strain is he makes up science sometimes. So like, for example, in this book, what we were just talking about, the one man theory, he talks about how it's like been studied and there's all this stuff. It's completely made up. There's
Oh,
nothing
of
about it that's real.
course. He does a good job about it. And that I
Yeah,
think that's something important to talk about is specificity. Because right at the beginning, like he does this intro to the book that is very real. Like
yeah.
he talks about, oh, this project Wildfire in Rock, Nevada, and it's based on this, as if the book is based on some real project. And he got me. I had to go look it up. I was like, was this an actual thing? So
Not at all.
I'm like,
Yeah.
this can't
Right.
be real. And then, but I did have to Google it because I mean, he convinced me.
Yeah.
It was very convincing. And um, yeah, I mean, just for the whole thing, the specificity, the tone, like there's a gravity to the tone of this book,
Yeah.
and he has it throughout. It's very serious. He has
Mhm.
the serious tone, and you're like, I believe you for all
I
the
believe,
things that you say. I don't know if they're true or not, but I do believe you.
yeah. In State of Fear, he actually makes up scientific articles in his footnotes. And this is just
Oh,
a fun Crichton story. He gets
wow.
he gets called out by a journalist named Michael Connolly. I totally
Mhm.
remember when this happened. Because I read State of Fear and I was like, hey, I don't like this one. He gets called out by this journalist, Michael Connolly, for like, hey, you're making up that research, and the rest of the research isn't really well documented. Like, what are you doing? So Crichton then writes a book called Next, which is about transgenic animals. It's like a, half people, half like Dr. Violet Moreau type thing.
Mhm.
And then he puts a character in the book named Michael Crowley after who is a journalist who has the same background, but he makes the character a pedophile with a quote unquote small penis. So
Oh,
so that's
and the
just
defamation lawsuits ensued.
it was, yeah. So just to give you like this is who he is. But he writes a nonfiction book called 24 Hours, which becomes the TV show ER. He writes the screenplays Coma, Extremely Close Up, Westworld, which, yes, that is the one that HBO did, Jurassic Park, Rising Sun, and Twister. He writes the thing Twister.
Wow.
But anyway, so just a run of like
Yeah.
super famous storytelling and novels from this guy.
And I
Um,
was thinking that when I was reading too, I was like, this book, despite all its flaws, would be easily adapted into a screenplay. Like
Everything was.
every easily
yeah.
adapted, and you don't need a lot of character because the actors are going to bring their character and their take to it,
Mhm.
right? Just like your
That's
audio
interesting.
narrator that I didn't.
Mhm.
I'm like, this would be very cinematic. The idea, it's those high concept ideas that
Mhm.
Hollywood wants, right? And I'm like, this still is a high concept idea that you could sell today.
Oh
He
yeah.
a lot of the movies that
Sell it
get
in 30
made for
seconds.
screenplays he writes. Like he wrote
Yeah.
the screenplay for Jurassic Park. He writes the screenplay for Sphere. He writes the like he's doing the like follow up. Um, all right, which of these characters, if any, would you want to go to dinner with?
Peter Jackson. No Sterno though. No Sterno.
I didn't know I thought Sterno was some kind of like 70s alcohol that I didn't understand that he's drinking Sterno.
Yeah.
So I looked it up and it's like, no, it's the things you light on fire beneath
Yeah.
the Yeah. I didn't know people could drink. I thought that would be like instant death. I didn't know
Yeah.
that you could literally drink Sterno.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't go and drink Sterno based on this book. We just talked about the fact that he makes things up. But
No.
Yeah. Tom, anybody you'd go to dinner with?
probably Levitt, who was the one who would pose all the wacko philosophical theories. Because I think that would be interesting. Stone would be utterly insufferable.
Yeah.
Hall's
Yeah.
kind of a blank slate, like
Yeah.
whatever. And as we pointed out, there's really no women on the list to choose.
There's that one woman who seems to like serve their needs. She ends up picking up Hall when he falls out of the thing.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
the only.
there's a great scene where no, she runs the other way.
Does she run away? I thought she picked him
Yeah,
up.
no,
I'm
uh,
misremembering.
Yeah,
she runs
Tom's right. She
away,
runs the other way. Yeah.
which is a great little moment where he's like, "Help!" But of course, if you work in a biological lab and someone comes through air shaft. It's like, help me. Gonna be like, check, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's none of them even like call their wives.
No.
No.
They're like, we could be down here for months, and that's just fine.
Yeah.
Stone
Yeah.
says it several times. This could take a year now.
Yeah.
I'm cool with that. Like, and yeah, so yeah, I thought Levitt was the most fun. I also, I don't want to get deep into this, but for someone with lots of facts, there are so many holes, like so many holes in the plot. Like, has somebody for 2 years been in this lab under the ground feeding these lab animals? Or did they bring them in when they found out that they were bringing a specimen? And if so, how would they have gotten all of them through the 6 levels of, like, there's so much that's not explained. So which we don't have to delve into, but like it doesn't hold a lot of
It does seem like the facility would need a small army to like
Mhm.
keep it staffed and going, and that don't exist in the book. Yeah.
No. Did you have a dinner guest, Jeff?
I really this is a weird one. They keep coming back to this army commander who seems to just be like trying to do his job, and
Yeah.
he's so tired every time they come back to him.
Malachuk or something like
Yeah.
that. I can't remember his name.
I want to
but
go to
yeah.
dinner with that guy. That guy seems like a lot of fun.
Oh, you know what was fast? And again, one of the things he does right, and I keep thinking of Dan Brown because Dan Brown, like, his facts actually are real. Like when he's talking, no, I mean when he's talking about like a scientific
Yeah.
instrument or something, it really exists. He wrote a whole book like with the NSA as the secret character because nobody who knew who the NSA was yet. But he does Crichton does a thing at the beginning where I totally forgot now because my mind has apparently has bacteria in it. But yeah, I don't remember what we were talking now. Totally lost my frame, and we can't edit it out because we don't edit.
I don't
We
edit.
don't
Just-
edit.
I
It's
we'll
don't
just
move
edit.
gonna
on.
be in there now.
But
Yeah.
it had something to do with him introducing information in a way that worked.
There's
but
a
not
thing
now.
I don't think I ever got followed up on, which was Burton is obsessed with the birds
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh,
at the first.
it did get followed up on.
Yeah,
What was
they
it?
have high metabolism.
High
Oh, is that
metabolism.
what it is?
And
Okay. I
yeah,
didn't catch it.
which,
Well, like I said, I kind of glaze over the scientific stuff in a Crichton novel. It becomes just white noise. I'm just like, oh, I feel smart reading these words. And then it was back to the characters. Yeah. All right, anything else about the book we want to talk about? Recommend? Yes, no?
I'd have to
Uh,
go no. Oh, I think the thing I was going to say was I'm fairly new to audio, and it's actually I think making me like books more that I would not like
Hmm.
written because again, Presumed Innocent was terrible, but I was compelled to listen because the I really felt like somebody was telling me a story.
Yeah.
And David Morse in this, like, it's only ridiculous when you get to the pages where he's like reading a readout of a radio conversation.
That was
it's
really,
like,
I did listen to that
it's
part.
like,
That was really funny.
Chief, is there anything out there? Pilot, no. Chief, are you sure? Pilot, no. Or there was one that each one was time stamped.
Yeah.
Each
He's
thing was,
reading the
and he had
timestamps.
to read the timestamp, and I was like, God bless you, man. But yeah, so that's a sort of interesting psychological, like, am I more, I'm not going to say liking, but am I more sort of riveted by these books because I'm listening to a human tell me the story rather than
Yeah.
pulling it off a page? And I don't know the answer to that. I guess any last thoughts I would have for you guys is classic of the genre. So, like, what do we have because of this? And is that good or bad?
Oh, I mean,
yeah.
Christine, what are your thoughts on that?
My comparison all the way reading this through was Andy Weir because he's also the science
Yeah.
thriller, very, very technical. And I read The Martian and I read Project Hail Mary. I skipped Artemis because it didn't get good reviews. But The Martian was just one character who was very funny.
Mhm.
And then Project Hail Mary, you see him trying to do character development. Because like at the beginning, it's not a spoiler because at the beginning his whole crew dies
Mhm.
and he's just out there by himself. And, it's just you watch Andy where geek out on the science stuff and then just throw in one line of, oh, but my crew's dead. I'm sad. Back to geeking out about science. And I just,
Yeah. Yeah.
so, and, so I don't know if I would like recommend Andromeda Strain, but now it does kind of I want to go back and read some later Michael Crichton books to see how his character development has changed, how his storytelling has changed, if at all. I have vague recollections of Jurassic Park and being more engaged in it than I was in Andromeda Strain.
Yeah.
So I might like skip ahead 20 years and see where he's at then.
If you're gonna read a Crichton, I would read Sphere.
Yeah.
That was supposed to be a sequel to this, by the way, but he
Yeah. I was
couldn't.
gonna
I
say,
read
wasn't
that
that
too.
about the same time that
He
Sphere?
wrote it around the same time, but then it doesn't
Yeah.
get published until the late 80s
Okay.
because it was supposed to be a sequel to this, and he was trying to write it. The plot of Sphere is that an ancient alien civilization has crashed a spaceship in the middle of the ocean that's been there forever, and we just found it. And
Yeah.
so they go down in a submarine. Part of the thriller aspect of Sphere is that they're in a submarine. And so there's a lot of fear around like what happens when the water comes in.
Yeah.
So there's when it at points it does.
Valid
So
fear.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so there it's a really great I think Crichton book. I'd recommend that one. If you want a Crichton book that's not technical, Rising Sun is great. It's a crime thriller that takes place in Japan. Um it was really interesting. Uh I wouldn't. The only one of his later books I'd recommend is Prey. That's about nanotechnology, and it's again, it's he does a lot of these like closed lab things, like spheres in a submarine, Jurassic Park's on an island. Like it's this like you're trapped in this place. Disclosure has a weird kind of closed element to it because it's like one company. They're all kind of trapped. That's his one about sexual harassment, which I don't recommend because it's not very nice to women. But Prey is a nanotechnology lab where the
Yeah.
nanotech kind of gets away, and they're all
Yeah.
like running away from nanotechnology. Yeah.
And just what you said there, isolation is such a great technique for thrillers, horror. If
Hmm.
you can isolate your characters, cut off their cell phones,
Yeah.
that's the way to go.
Isolation and the fear of death is
Yeah.
the two like yeah. And what I like about what I think really makes Crichton a thriller is like John Trudy says in his book, The Anatomy of Genre, the difference between thrillers and mysteries is thrillers, you know who the bad guy is the whole time. And with like Crichton books, it's like, oh yeah, the dinosaurs are the bad guy. They're going to eat you. Like it's
Yeah.
not like, oh yeah, the this little bug that turns everybody's blood into solid matter
Yeah.
is the bad guy. Yeah.
That's
But hey, those are the
interesting.
ones I'd recommend. If you want a new one, I'd do Prey. If you want like his classic, I'd probably do Sphere or Rising Sun. Okay.
Not to geek out on story, but I what I had always heard was that in a thriller is a mystery where the main character is in mortal peril,
Hmm.
as
Yeah.
opposed to the main character being a step removed by being a detective
Hmm.
or
Mm.
something else. And
Yeah.
sometimes a detective story becomes more of a
Because
thriller
they're in
because
mortal peril.
they become
Yeah.
as the thing goes on. Um, and again, we didn't really talk about dialogue. Don't know if we. It was all right.
It was very sciency.
Yeah. We talked about voice. I think, the old man has the
Yeah.
best voice by
He
far,
does. Yeah.
like Christine
Um,
said in the characters.
and again, with you said something at the top which really affected me. I think Christine said about you can write a screenplay knowing that the actors are going to bring the character to it. And I think of like Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park, right?
Yeah.
Like I uh and I think the audio narrator did that in this, especially with Burton, who I had, and the old man, and with Peter Jackson, but also like the he gave color to the scientist that wasn't really on the page. I felt like he was like, okay, I'm gonna make this guy a little halting and hesitant, and I'm gonna make this guy a little aloof. And mm, uh, yeah, in terms of classic of the genre or whatever it set the stage for, I wonder again from listening to this conversation, like who else was sort of at the forefront of writing books that they knew would be movies. because it
Grisham.
changes the way of Grisham.
Yeah,
Do you
Grisham was
think
writing books for movies.
yeah, eventually.
Yeah, not right away, but
Yeah.
I would say after The Firm,
Mhm.
he's writing books that he hopes become movies.
Right. And
And then he
we've
gave up. Later, Grisham,
right.
he just gives up. I still read him. I still
Um,
love it, but he totally just gives up.
and you look at Presumed Innocent, and it was made into a movie, but there was no way it was written to be a
No, it
movie.
wasn't written that way.
Yeah, not at all. And same with Tuck Everlasting, or whatever. But this idea of writing books knowing they're going to be a movie, I'm not sure. I don't think it's a good development necessarily, uh, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say some authors of this time actually write books so that, like, try to turn this into a movie. Like I think about Clancy, who's the other big movie book guy. I feel like I also read all of his books as a teenager, and I feel like his books were like, I want to see you turn this in. Good luck. Like I'm going to give you 45 pages about a submarine schematics. Let's see if you can turn this into a movie.
So
Yeah.
I've not read Clancy, and I really don't want to. But is it similar issues here with just like massive information dumps?
They're very similar. They're very like, it's so funny thinking back on what you read as a teenager and to be like, yeah, that's what I was
Yeah.
into.
I
They're
read one
very,
Clancy book. What's the one where they blow up the stadium? Is that Some of All Fears?
Some of
Or
All Fears
yeah,
is the
that's the
one where
book
they
that I
set
read,
off a nuclear
where they're
bomb in Baltimore. Yeah,
going to blow up a
going to
stadium.
blow up a stadium.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, Clancy is it's very similar to Crichton in that it's very heavy in its world. But his world is always kind of the Navy. So
Yeah.
he's military, but it's specifically
More
the
military. I didn't
Navy.
find it as
Yeah.
technical, or maybe I just didn't because they're describing guns or
Yeah, he's not as technical. He's more
helicopters
like
or whatever. I didn't mind that as
he
much.
does a lot of geopolitics stuff. He
Yeah.
does a lot of like, here's how these nations interact with each other and trade deals, and this
Yeah.
went here and this went there. That in the end all just gets scrubbed from the movies. Like in the movies, you just get Harrison Ford running around being Jack
Yeah.
Ryan, but
Mhm.
in the or Alec Baldwin or Chris Pine or there's been a couple Jack Ryans. But yeah, I don't know. I will say Crichton's better at sorry, Clancy is better at characterization.
I
Jack
agree.
Ryan is somebody you really
100% agree with
want to
that. Yeah.
hang out with. Like
Mhm.
he's a yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Christine, the last question we always ask a guest outside forgetting this book, what
Forgetting
would
this
you
book.
recommend any listeners read?
For science thrillers?
No, anything,
Anything.
Oh,
anything you want.
Anything
anything.
you're reading. Yeah.
Give us something to read.
Oh, I was gonna go with science thrillers. I'm
That's
like, yep.
fine.
If
That's
you
great.
like science thrillers, you have to read Andy Weir. I mean, because
Yeah.
he's the science thriller guy. And Blake Crouch is amazing at taking those science ideas and making them thrilling. I loved Recursion. I love Dark Matter. His latest one, Upgrade, was more thriller than the science stuff I love, so I didn't love it as much,
Mm,
which I found interesting because I'm like, I want more spec in this. The spec is too realistic. Give me more of a thought problem.
mm.
Um, yeah, so I think if you like that, I also read The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. Hopefully, I'm not butchering that last name. Uh, which was not science thriller, but had some big science ideas in it on genetic engineering that were a super fun read. It is a bit space opera, but so engaging. Um, I mean, Three Body Problem,
Mm.
I'm gonna Lou Session. Hopefully, I said that
Yeah.
right. Amazing science ideas. China Mieville is the king. If you like big ideas, Embassy Town is his science fiction one, but it's more about
Never read that one.
language than science. But it's not an
Mm.
easy read, but it's fascinating. So if you
Nice.
like things in this arena, those are my
Okay.
recommendations. Yeah.
Nice. Thanks. Well, thanks for coming on. Thanks for doing this with us.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'll hit stop. We can talk a little bit more. Oh,
All
and
right.
go to Christine's website, ChristineDaigleBooks.com, and
Yeah.
get her new book, Heavy Are the Stones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.